The rain had been falling on Aldenmere for 3 days without pause, and by the third night it had found every crack in the roof of Thorn Cottage that old Mr. Ashby had promised, for years, to mend. Water pooled in a tin basin set beneath the worst of the leaks, and the sound of it, drop after drop after drop, had become so familiar to the house that no one startled at it anymore. The garden beyond the kitchen window had gone to weeds 2 winters past, when there had still been a gardener to lose. Now the roses that had once climbed the south wall in high summer hung black and curled, like something that had reached for the light and been refused it. The house itself seemed to hold its breath through each grey afternoon, waiting for a fortune that was not coming, for a father who was not returning, for some correction to a ledger that could not be corrected. It was, in every way that mattered, a house keeping quiet company with its own ruin. In the small back parlour, by the last inch of a tallow candle she had been rationing since Michaelmas, Miss Marianne Ashby sat mending the hem of her mother's second-best gown, the one that would have to serve as her mother's best gown now, since the first had been sold along with the silver 2 years before. Her needle moved in small exact stitches, the kind a woman learns when she has been taught that waste is a sin nearly equal to pride. She did not hum as she worked, though she wanted to. Her mother did not like humming after dark, said it was common, said a lady bore her burdens in silence. So Marianne bore hers in silence, and counted the candle down to its last 1/4 inch, and thought, as she often did at this hour, that she had become very good at making very little look like very much. She was 23, unmarried, and, as her mother reminded her at least once a week, usually at supper, usually in front of whichever neighbour had come to call, entirely without a dowry to offer any man foolish enough to want her. "You will simply have to be sensible about it," her mother said now, appearing in the parlour doorway, with her shawl clutched at her throat, as though the cold were a personal insult. Mrs. Ashby had been a beauty once. The bones of it were still there, arranged now into a permanent expression of aggrieved patience. "Sir Reginald called again today. He asked after you particularly." "I was in the still room," Marianne said, not looking up from her mending. "I did not know he called." "You are always in the still room, or the kitchen, or mending something no one will thank you for mending." Her mother's mouth thinned. "Sir Reginald does not require a dowry, Marianne. Do you understand what a mercy that is, at your age, in our situation? He does not care that your father left us nothing. He wants you regardless. Most men would not." "I am aware of what he wants," Marianne said quietly, and something in her tone made her mother look at her sharply, though neither of them said the rest of it aloud. That what Sir Reginald Combe wanted was not a wife so much as a young, biddable, unpaid-for ornament for his declining years. A woman with no family fortune behind her to make demands, no brothers to call him to account, nothing but gratitude, which he clearly expected in generous supply. "Georgiana would not speak to me so," her mother said, which was true, because Georgiana, 2 years younger, golden-haired, and betrothed since spring to a baronet's son with actual prospects, had never once been asked to be sensible about anything. Georgiana had been permitted to refuse 2 suitors already this year, for want of liking their conversation. No one had suggested Georgiana ought to be grateful that a man wanted her without a dowry, because no one had ever needed to suggest it. Georgiana was decorative, and decorative women were not expected to be grateful. They were expected only to exist, beautifully, and be chosen. "I only mean to say," her mother went on, softening now into the tone she used when she wanted something, and knew guilt was the surer road to it than command, "that we cannot all be so fortunate as your sister. Some of us must be practical. You have always been the practical one, Marianne. It is, I think, your finest quality." She said it the way one might praise a servant's steady hand, and left the room without waiting for an answer, because she had not, in truth, been asking a question. Marianne set down her needle and pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her eyes, hard enough to see small bursts of light behind the lids. She did not cry. She had decided, long ago, somewhere in the year after her father's death, when the bills had come like a slow tide and no one had wept them away, that tears changed nothing at all, and that a woman who wished to keep her wits about her could not afford the indulgence of losing them to weeping. So she breathed, and picked the needle back up, and finished the hem, and blew out what remained of the candle, and went to bed in the dark, dry-eyed, with Sir Reginald Coomb's soft, wet hands and softer, wetter compliments sitting in her mind like something spoiled left too long in a larder, some 40 miles distant, in a house considerably larger and considerably colder in every way that did not involve stone. Julian Vane, 9th Duke of Stirling, stood in his mother's rooms for the first time since her funeral, and found that he could not make himself cross the threshold fully. He stood in the doorway instead, one hand braced against the frame, looking at the dust sheets someone had draped over her writing desk and her reading chair, and the little portrait of his father that she had kept on her mantel until the day she died. Though his father had been 11 years in the ground, and had not, by any account Julian had ever been able to verify, deserved the loyalty. He was 31, unmarried, and in possession of the kind of fortune that made men lie to him constantly, and women look at him as though he were a ledger they wished to balance in their favor. His mother's death 4 months prior had left him a duke in full, no longer merely heir to the burden, and it had also left him, this was the part he did not say aloud to his steward, his solicitor, or his aunt, who had begun, with what she clearly believed was great subtlety, introducing the subject of his remarriage at every meal. Entirely alone in a house built for a family that no longer existed. He had been engaged once, 4 years past, to a woman named Cordelia Ashe, daughter of an earl, celebrated for her wit and her waltzing, and she had broken it within a fortnight of learning his father's debts were worse than rumored, informing him with admirable frankness that she had agreed to marry a duke. Not a duke's difficulties. He had not been heartbroken. Precisely. He had been instructed. He had learned, at 26, exactly what his title was worth to a woman, and exactly what he, absent the title, was worth to nobody, and he had carried that lesson forward like a man carries a scar he has stopped noticing except when someone touches it. You cannot simply disappear, Your Grace. His steward, Mr. Whitlock, said now, following him down the corridor with the particular exasperation of a man who had served the family for 30 years and had therefore earned the right to exasperation. There is the matter of the northern tenancies and Lady Stirling's letters regarding the Michaelmas ball, and I am not disappearing, Julian said. I am going to look at a horse. This was strictly true, though it was not the whole of the truth. There was a horse, a difficult grey gelding, recently purchased sight unseen from a dealer in the West, reputed unrideable, currently causing havoc in the stables of a minor estate 2 counties distant, where Julian's aunt had, in her matchmaking zeal, arranged for him to stay as a guest of a family she was certain would produce a suitable duchess. Julian had no intention of staying as a guest. He had every intention of arriving instead as a groom, plain clothes, an assumed name, a skill with horses that was not affectation but genuine, learned in boyhood from a stable master, who had cared more for him than his own father ever had, and observing, unremarked and unheralded, whatever family his aunt believed she was delivering him to. He had been managed by well-meaning relations and calculating mothers enough in the last 4 years to trust nothing that arrived at him, wrapped in an invitation. He would rather see a family as it behaved when it believed no duke was watching. He did not, if he examined the impulse honestly, expect to find anything worth finding. He expected simpering daughters and a mother counting his acreage before the tea had cooled. He had expected this of every family for 4 years, and had not yet been proven wrong, and he told himself, packing a groom's plain coat instead of his own, that he expected nothing different now. He was, in this, a man testing a theory he had already decided was true, which is its own particular kind of blindness, though he would not have called it that. He arrived at Aldenmere on a grey afternoon a week later, introducing himself to the stable hands of the estate where his aunt's friend the squire lived. The estate that bordered, as it happened, the smaller and shabbier grounds of Thorn Cottage, as Jules Hart, a groom lately out of a place in the west, seeking work with the difficult grey. He was given a cot above the stable, and told to see what he could do with the beast, and within the hour he understood precisely why the horse had a reputation. It was not vicious. It was frightened, badly handled, flinching from any hand raised too quickly near its head, and Julian, who understood frightened things rather better than he understood confident ones, set himself to the slow work of it without complaint. It was on the second morning, before the household proper had risen, that he saw her for the first time, though he did not yet know her name. She came along the low stone wall dividing the two properties with a basket over one arm, moving with the unhurried economy of someone accustomed to doing several things at once, and none of them for her own pleasure, and she stopped at the sight of the grey gelding, straining and sweating against its lead in the paddock, ears flat, eyes white-ringed with fear, and a man, Julian, standing well back from it with the patient stillness of someone waiting for a wild thing to remember it was not in fact at war. "You are letting him tire himself for nothing," she said without preamble, over the wall. "He is not fighting the rope. He is fighting the memory of whoever hurt him with it. You will only confirm the memory if you wait him out by force of will alone." Julian turned, startled less by the words than by the fact that they were, as far as he could judge in 11 years of horsemanship, entirely correct. "And what would you have me do instead?" he asked, because it seemed the honest question, and because something in her flat, unadorned certainty interested him more than any drawing-room compliment had in longer than he cared to count. "Sit down," she said, "in the grass, where he can see you are not a threat, and not leaving, and not asking anything of him at all. Horses do not trust patience that is performed. They trust patience that has nowhere better to be." He almost laughed. He caught it before it reached his mouth, an almost, the first of several he would not yet know to count, and instead did exactly as she suggested, lowering himself into the wet grass in his groom's coat, and watched the grey gelding's ears swivel toward him in something like confusion, and then, 20 minutes later, in something like curiosity, and the woman at the wall watched a moment longer, with the faint, unsurprised satisfaction of someone who had expected to be listened to and was pleased, without being especially flattered. To have been proven right. "Marianne," she said, when he asked her name, offering no surname, no curtsy, no simper. "You had best get up before your knees take a chill, Mr. Hart. There is a great deal of difference between patience and foolishness." She was gone before he could ask whether she thought him foolish generally, or only that morning, and he found, turning it over as he rubbed down the gelding an hour later, the animal leaning its great head into his hand now, with something almost like trust, that he wanted, rather badly, to know the answer. He learned her circumstances within the week, as one learns everything in a small parish, from the servants, from the squire's wife, from the vicar's sister, who was delighted to have a new pair of ears for old gossip. Miss Marianne Ashby, 23, of Thorn Cottage, whose father had died in debt, and whose mother had, by all accounts, made rather a project of reminding her of it daily. There was a younger sister, golden and betrothed and universally adored. There was, circling the family like a patient vulture, one Sir Reginald Combe, a baronet twice widowed, thrice the girl's age, whose interest in Marianne was explained by the vicar's sister with a delicacy that did not disguise the substance of it, that he wanted a young wife and did not require money to have one, which in the local telling was accounted a generosity on his part, rather than what Julian, listening, understood it rather plainly to be. He found himself, in the days that followed, taking the long way to the paddock past the low stone wall more often than the horse strictly required. He watched her manage things. That was the word that kept returning to him. Watching her from a careful distance he told himself was merely convenient. She managed. He saw her turn a torn glove into a mended one with 3 neat stitches, while standing in a doorway giving instructions to a cook about stretching a joint of mutton across 4 days. He saw her walk 2 miles into the village and back to save the cost of sending a servant who could not, in truth, be spared for the errand. He saw her, one grey noon, kneel in the ruined garden behind Thorn Cottage and clear dead growth from around a single rose bush that had somehow survived 2 winters of neglect, working the black and curling stems free with bare, reddened hands. And he thought, watching her from the far side of the wall, with the gelding's lead loose in his own hand, that he had never in 4 years of calculating mothers and simpering daughters seen a woman do a single thing that was not, in some fashion, a performance for an audience she wished to impress. Marianne Ashby performed for no one. She simply did the next necessary thing, over and over, because no one else would, and she did it, he noticed, without complaint, and almost, without bitterness, though he began to suspect the bitterness was there, banked low like a fire kept carefully from view. He saw the cruelty too, the second contrast the family provided, without ever meaning to provide it for an audience. He was mending a bridle near the kitchen garden one afternoon, when Mrs. Ashby's voice carried through the open window, sharp with the particular exasperation reserved only for a daughter who has stopped being useful enough to overlook her plainness. You will thank Sir Reginald when he calls, Marianne, and you will thank him prettily. Do you imagine any other man is queuing at our door? Georgiana will have her season, her wedding clothes, her settlement, because her face has earned it. You have your competence, which is a fine thing in a housekeeper, and a poor one in a daughter I am meant to see settled. Be grateful someone will have you at all. He did not hear Marianne's answer, if she gave one. He heard only, a moment later, the scrape of a chair and quick footsteps toward the garden, and when he glanced up over the low wall, he saw her standing very still among the dead roses, with her chin lifted and her jaw set, and her eyes bright, and fixed hard on some middle distance. And he understood, watching her master it in perhaps 4 long breaths, that this was a woman who had trained herself out of weeping the way other women trained themselves into it, and he felt something shift in his chest that he did not yet have a name for. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. It was Sir Reginald Coomber himself who forced the matter, some 10 days later, arriving at Thorn Cottage in a hired chaise with a ring in his pocket he had not been asked to bring, and an assumption in his manner that he would not need to ask twice. Julian, delivering a mended harness to the squire's groom that same afternoon, and taking, as he had taken to doing, the path that ran alongside the Ashby garden wall, heard the whole of it through the parlour's open window, and stood very still with the harness over his arm and his jaw tight, in a way that had nothing to do with horses. I do not require a dowry, Mrs. Ashby, Coomber was saying, in the wet, satisfied voice of a man who believes generosity and ownership to be the same transaction. I have said so from the start. Your daughter's situation troubles me not at all. A man of my years wants a young wife with sense enough to run a household, and gratitude enough not to make demands of him. I think we understand each other. You are very good, Sir Reginald, Mrs. Ashby said, in the voice she used for company. Marianne will be sensible of the honour. Will she? It was not, from Coombe, a question. I confess I should like to hear it from her own lips before I go to the trouble of a settlement. Women are odd creatures about being asked prettily, even when the answer is already decided. There was a silence, and then Marianne's voice, low and level, addressing no one in particular in the room but audible, Julian thought, to whoever was listening at the wall, whether she knew it or not. I am very sensible of the honour Sir Reginald does me, she said, and there was something in the careful flatness of it, the exact correctness, that told Julian more clearly than tears could have, that she meant not one word of the sentiment, and had been given no room to mean anything else. He walked the rest of the way to the stable, with the harness biting into his forearm from how hard his hand had closed on it, and found the grey gelding waiting at the paddock rail, and stood with his forehead against the animal's warm neck for a long moment, working out why the sound of a woman surrendering to a fate she did not choose should feel, to a man who had known her a fortnight, like something being taken from him personally. He began, after that, to bring the horse to the low wall in the evenings, on the thin excuse of exercising it along the lane, and she began, after the first few evenings, to come out and meet him there, and they spoke, of horses first, and then of gardens, and then, slowly, carefully, skirting the edges of it, the way one skirts a wound still healing, of fathers who left debts, and mothers who counted worth in acreage, and sisters who were loved for reasons that had nothing to do with anything they had done to earn it. "You are very patient with him," she said one evening, watching the gelding lip at the grass near Julian's boot with none of its old wariness. "You have made him trust you in a fortnight what a lesser man could not have done in a year. He only wanted someone to stop expecting him to be broken," Julian said, "and start expecting him to be well, eventually, if given time enough not to be rushed toward it." He heard, as he said it, that he was no longer entirely speaking of the horse, and from the way her eyes lifted to his, and held there a beat too long before she looked away, he suspected she had heard it too. "You speak like a man who has thought a great deal about being broken," she said quietly. "I have thought a great deal," he said, "about being expected to be something other than what I am, by people who had already decided what I was worth before they troubled themselves to look. That," she said, with the ghost of something that was almost a smile, "is a very fine sentiment for a groom to have arrived at." "Grooms think a great deal," he said. "We have a great deal of quiet in which to do it." It was, he would reflect later, the nearest he had come to lying to her outright, and it sat uneasily even as he said it, because he had begun, without quite deciding to want very much for her to know him, the whole of him, Duke and grief and all, and to want it before rank or fortune could arrange her feelings for her, the way it had arranged Cordelia Ashes, the way it arranged every feeling every woman of his acquaintance had ever professed to hold for him. He almost told her, that evening. He got as far as drawing breath for it, watching her face in the last grey light, with the gelding's warm weight leaning against his shoulder, and then her mother's voice called sharply from the cottage door, summoning her in for supper, and the moment passed, folded itself away, became the second almost he would carry forward, without yet knowing its worth. The engagement to Sir Reginald Coombe was announced, without Marianne's meaningful consent, at the end of that month, her mother having grown weary of waiting for a gratitude that showed no sign of arriving on its own. Marianne learned of it not from her mother directly, but from the vicar's sister, who congratulated her in the village lane with such evident satisfaction that Marianne understood, standing there with a basket of thread going heavy on her arm, that the whole parish had known before she had, that her own life had been decided and distributed as news before it had been given to her as a choice. She went that evening to the low stone wall with something hard and bright lodged behind her ribs that she refused, on principle, to call panic, and found Jules' heart waiting with the grey gelding, as he had come to wait most evenings now, and she said, without any of her usual composure, "I am to be married to Sir Reginald Coombe within the month. It has been announced. I was not asked." He was very still for a long moment, and if you were asked, he said, "Lo, what would you say?" "That I would rather," she said, and her voice shook once, badly, before she mastered it, "I would very much rather marry a man with nothing at all, who asked me plainly and let me answer honestly, than a man with a fortune, who has never once, in the whole of his courtship, asked me anything he expected me to refuse." "I have nothing at all," Julian said quietly. "I have a groom's wage and a good horse, and a cot above a stable that is not even mine. I am asking you plainly, Marianne. I am letting you answer honestly. I love you. I believe I have loved you since you told me a frightened thing does not trust patience that is performed. Marry me, not him. Me, with nothing, and let it be your own choosing for once in your life." She looked at him a long moment in the failing light, and he watched her weigh it. Not sentiment, he understood, but arithmetic of a harder kind. The arithmetic of a woman deciding whether poverty freely chosen was preferable to comfort forced upon her, and he watched her arrive, visibly, at the only answer that had ever truly been hers to give. 1, 2, 3. He counted the seconds of her silence without meaning to, the old habit of a man braced for a verdict, and on the fourth she said, yes, and it was the plainest, truest word he had heard spoken in 4 years by a woman looking at him. They were married 8 days later, by special license Julian obtained under his own name, from a magistrate 2 towns distant, who had no notion whose signature he was witnessing, in a small stone church with none of the Ashby family present, because Marianne had told her mother nothing until the deed was done, having learned, in 23 years, precisely how much room her mother's opinions would be given to alter her course if spoken aloud beforehand. She wore her mother's mended second-best gown. She carried, at Julian's quiet insistence, a single rose cut from the surviving bush in the Thorn Cottage garden, its bloom small and imperfect, and entirely, defiantly alive. "You have married a groom," Julian said afterward, as they rode in a hired carriage away from the little church, and something in his voice was strange to her, careful in a way she could not yet place. "I want you to know, before we go further, that I do not regret a single part of what I have to offer you, poor as it is." "I have not married a fortune," Marianne said, leaning her head briefly against his shoulder, exhausted in the particular way of a woman who has spent a great deal of courage in a single week. "I have married a man who asked me plainly. That is a great deal more than I was offered anywhere else." The carriage, however, did not turn toward the small cottage in the west that Julian had described to her in their evenings at the wall. It turned instead onto a long avenue lined with ancient oaks, and Marianne sat up, frowning faintly at the window, at the gatehouse they passed with its liveried porter, at the second gate beyond it, at the house that rose slowly out of the parkland ahead of them, grey stone, vast, lit gold in a dozen windows, a house she recognized, with a cold lurch of understanding, from a print she had once seen in a newspaper her father had left lying open on the breakfast table. "Julian," she said, very carefully, "whose house is this?" He did not answer at once. The carriage drew to a stop before the great door, and a footman in sterling livery came forward at a run to open it, saying, before either of them had descended, "Welcome home, your grace," and bowing so low his powdered head nearly touched his own knee, and Marianne sat frozen in the carriage seat, with her hand still curled in her new husband's, staring at him as though she had never seen him before at all. "I am the Duke of Stirling," Julian said quietly, watching her face with the careful, braced stillness of a man who has just discovered exactly how much he has to lose. "I did not lie to you about anything that was in my heart, Marianne. I lied to you about my name and my station, because I have been courted for 4 years by women who wanted the title and never once troubled to want the man beneath it, and I wished, before I risked my heart again, to be certain that whoever chose me first. You chose a groom. I am asking you now to forgive me for not telling you, sooner, that the groom and the Duke were never 2 different men." She did not weep, though the pressure of it built hot and sudden behind her eyes. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing, and she held to that now with both hands, even as the whole architecture of what she had believed about her own marriage rearranged itself beneath her. "You let me think," she said slowly, "that I was rescuing myself into poverty. You let me be brave about nothing at all." "You were brave about everything," he said. "You chose a man with nothing over a man who offered comfort and contempt in the same breath. The fact that the nothing turned out to be a great deal changes what I can offer you. It does not change what you chose, or why." She sat with that a long moment, in the gold light spilling from the great door, and something in her, the part of her that had spent 23 years being managed, priced, and distributed by people who never once asked her opinion of the transaction, recognized, slowly, that this was different in kind from every disposal that had come before it. He had asked. He had let her answer honestly, believing him poor. The lie had been a fear, not a theft. "I do not yet know how to be a duchess," she said at last, low. "I do not yet know how to be looked at as anything but a title," he said. "We shall neither of us know how to do this perfectly. I would rather learn it with you than perform it flawlessly with anyone else." He almost reached for her hand fully then, the third and final almost, and this time he did not stop himself. He took it and felt her fingers close slowly, deliberately, around his own, and understood that whatever came next, they would come to it as two people who had chosen honestly, however imperfectly the honesty had been delivered. The first months at Marchwood, the great Sterling seat, were not easy ones. The staff, discreet as they were trained to be, could not entirely disguise their astonishment at a duchess who knew how to mend a hymn and stretch a joint of mutton, and had upon arrival quietly reorganized the housekeeper's linen accounts to save £11 a quarter without being asked. Julian's aunt, arriving within a fortnight in a fury of propriety, demanded to know what madness had possessed her nephew to marry a penniless nobody from a debt-ridden family in Eldonmere, and was met, to her visible surprise, by a young duchess who answered her questions with perfect composure and not one flicker of the shame Lady Sterling had clearly expected to provoke. Lady Sterling did not leave satisfied, whatever composure she had been met with, and she said so plainly enough before her carriage departed, informing Julian in the front hall that a groom's manners, however well disguised beneath silk, would show themselves eventually in a duchess who had not been raised to the position, and that he would do well to prepare himself for the disappointment. Julian did not trouble to answer her. He had learned, in a fortnight, that Marianne required no defending from words alone, since she had a habit of answering them with deeds that made the words themselves look foolish in retrospect. It was the northern tendencies that proved this first, and most publicly. A dispute had been simmering for a year between two farming families over a boundary hedge and a right-of-way that Mr. Whitlock had failed, by his own admission, to settle to either side's satisfaction, and Julian rode out one morning intending to hear both parties and impose a judgment, only to find that Marianne had asked to come with him, and that by the time they arrived at the disputed hedgerow she had already, through some quiet correspondence of her own in the preceding days, learned the particular grievance beneath the grievance, that the elder farmer's son had been passed over for a cottage promised to him, and that the boundary dispute was, in truth, a proxy for that older wound. She said as much to Julian in a low aside before either family had finished bowing to their duke, and the judgment he delivered an hour later, incorporating her observation, settled the matter so thoroughly that both families sent baskets of produce to Marchwood for a month afterward in gratitude neither had thought to offer Mr. Whitlock in a year of his own efforts. "You might have told me that before I formed my own opinion of the thing," Julian said afterward, riding back through the low autumn light with something between amusement and admiration in his voice. "I did tell you," Marianne said. "You were merely too busy composing your judgment to hear it the first time. Dukes are not always the best listeners, whatever their intentions." "I am learning," he said. "I have had a very good teacher this past 12-month. There was a garden at Marchwood too, larger and grander than the ruined one at Thorn Cottage, that had gone to neglect in the years of Julian's mother's illness and his own long grief, and Marianne took to it within the first month, the way she had taken to the single dying rosebush at home, quietly, without asking permission, clearing dead growth with her own hands until the head gardener, scandalized at first, came to admire and then to assist her. Julian found her there often in the late afternoons, kneeling among the beds in an old gown she refused to give up, despite the abundance of new ones now available to her, and he began, without quite noticing, he had begun, to bring his correspondence out to the stone bench beside the roses, simply to be near the sound of her working. "You need not do this yourself," he said once, watching her tie back an unruly climbing rose along the south wall. "There are 11 gardeners on the grounds who would consider it their whole purpose." "I know," she said, not looking up. "I do it because it is mine to do, and because I like watching something come back to life that everyone else had given up on." She glanced sideways at him then, something warm and knowing in it. "You will find I do not easily give up on things that need only patience, and someone willing to sit with them a while." He thought, not for the first time, that she was speaking of more than roses. And he let the thought sit warm in his chest, instead of chasing it further, because some things, he had learned from her, were better proven slowly than declared too soon. The trouble, when it came first, as whisper, as trouble of that particular kind so often does. Word had travelled from Aldenmere, Mrs. Ashby, once the shock of her daughter's elevation had passed. Proved entirely willing to trade on it, writing to society acquaintances of her daughter the Duchess, with a pride that curdled, within weeks, into something uglier when Marianne did not immediately send for her, or install her at Marchwood in the style she felt entitled to. Sir Reginald Combe, humiliated at having been jilted for a groom who had turned out to be a duke, a fact that made his humiliation, if anything, sharper, since it proved definitively that Marianne had never wanted him even at his most advantageous, began, in his wounded vanity, to speak of the marriage in drawing-rooms as something other than it was. A very convenient elopement, he was reported to have said at a card party in town, for a girl with nothing behind her. One wonders how a penniless nobody contrives to snare a duke within a month of jilting a respectable baronet, unless she had rather more design in it than innocence. It was the kind of remark that required no proof to spread, only repetition, and by the time it reached Marchwood, filtered through 3 drawing-rooms and softened at each remove. It had grown into a settled rumour that the new Duchess of Stirling had trapped her husband through some scheme or other, a compromising situation contrived, a fortune hunted deliberately behind a mask of poverty, and that his family, the story went, would do well to look more closely into her character before the next season's invitations were extended. Marianne felt the change first in small ways, a coolness in the correspondence from families who had written warmly at the news of the marriage, an invitation to a neighbouring house withdrawn on a thin excuse, a look exchanged between 2 ladies at church that she was not meant to see and saw anyway. She said nothing of it to Julian at first, from the old habit of managing burdens quietly, rather than adding them to anyone else's ledger, and it was the head gardener, in the end, who let slip that her ladyship had seemed troubled of late, that brought Julian to find her in the rose garden at dusk, with her hands still and her composure, for once, visibly strained. "They are saying I trapped you," she said when he asked, and her voice was very level in the way he had learned meant she was working hard to keep it so. "That I schemed for this. That the poverty was a device." "They are saying it," Julian said, "because Sir Reginald Combe cannot bear to have been refused honestly, and because your mother has been careless in her pride, and because society would rather believe a woman clever and calculating than believe a duke capable of choosing honestly for himself. It is not true, and I will not let it stand. You cannot simply command a rumor to stop," she said. "I have watched rumors ruin better women than I am, for less cause." "No," he agreed. "But I can choose, publicly, where privately I have already chosen. There is a ball at Lady Farrington's fortnight hence. Half the ton that matters will be there, your mother and Sir Reginald among the invited, since Lady Farrington is fond of gossip, and fonder still, of watching it play out under her own chandeliers. We will go. And I will not let this rumor go unanswered a moment longer than it takes me to answer it properly." She looked at him a long moment in the fading light, the same look she had given him in the carriage months before, weighing something. "You would do that," she said slowly in front of everyone. "I married you in front of a magistrate and an empty church, because I was a coward about my own name," he said. "I will not compound that cowardice by being quiet now, when it is your name that wants defending instead of mine." The night before the ball, Julian found her in the rose garden long after the household had retired, sitting on the stone bench with a shawl drawn close against the chill, not working, for once simply sitting, and he came and sat beside her without speaking for a long moment. The way he had learned to sit beside a frightened animal that did not yet know whether it was safe to be still. "You are afraid," he said, at last, not as an accusation but as an observation offered gently, the way one offers a hand rather than a demand. "I am afraid of being laughed at," she said, low. "I have spent my whole life being told I was not worth looking at twice. I have made my peace with being overlooked. I do not know that I have made my peace with being looked at and found wanting, in front of everyone who matters, in a single evening." "They will not find you wanting," Julian said. "I have watched you mend a household on nothing, gentle a frightened horse with nothing but patience, and forgive a mother who has given you very little cause for forgiveness. Whatever they think they know of you tomorrow night, I promise you it will not survive contact with the truth of you for more than the length of a single dance." "You are very certain," she said, and there was the ghost of her old dry humor in it, returning despite herself. "I have learned to be certain of exactly one thing in 4 years of being uncertain of everyone else's motives," he said, taking her hand in the dark. "I am certain of you. I would stake the whole of the dukedom on it, if it came to that, and I do not offer such wagers lightly." She let herself lean into him then, in the cold garden, among roses that had not yet bloomed, but would, given time, and said nothing further, because there was, for once, nothing further that needed saying aloud. Lady Farrington's ball was, by the standards of the season, a triumph of exactly the kind that made such triumphs dangerous, every candle lit, every important family present. The kind of gathering where a single well-placed sentence could travel the length of the ballroom before the musicians had finished a single set. Marianne wore a gown of deep green that Julian had chosen with her, not for her, insisting she have some say in it, and she walked in on his arm with her chin, at the same level she had held it in the dead rose garden the day her mother had called her merely sensible. Her mother found her within the half hour, drawing her aside near the refreshment table with a bright, brittle smile that did not reach her eyes. "You might have written, Mrs. Ashby said, low and urgent. "You might have arranged for Georgiana to be presented at court through your connections. A duchess owes something to her family, surely, whatever unpleasantness has been said." "What unpleasantness, mother?" Marian asked, and something in the flatness of it made Mrs. Ashby's smile falter. It was Sir Reginald Coombe who forced the matter fully into the open, arriving at the edge of their small group, with a glass in hand, and malice worn thin over wounded pride. "Your Grace," he said to Marian, with a bow so shallow it was nearly an insult in itself, "how well marriage becomes you. Though I confess, I remain curious how a groom's cottage transformed itself so swiftly into a dukedom. In the telling, one wonders which version of the courtship was the performance. The nearest dozen conversations quieted, the way conversations do when something more interesting has begun nearby, and Julian, who had been speaking with Lord Farrington some 10 feet distant, turned and crossed the space between them without hurrying, arriving at his wife's side with the unhurried authority of a man who had, in fact, been waiting for precisely this opening. "Sir Reginald," Julian said, pleasantly, "I find I must correct a misapprehension you seem determined to spread at every table that will have you. My wife did not scheme for this marriage. She refused a fortune, believing me penniless, because she would rather be treated honestly by a poor man than dishonestly courted by a rich one. I have watched her, in the months since, run a household on figures that would humble half the stewards in this room, nurse a garden back from ruin with her own 2 hands, and defend tenants' interests to me with more precision than my own solicitor. She is not a woman who schemed her way into a title. She is a woman I very nearly lost the chance to marry at all, because I was too great a coward to tell her my own name." He let that settle a moment before he continued, and Marian, standing beside him, felt the old instinct to steady herself against tears rise hot behind her eyes, and held to it as she always had, though it cost her more this time than it ever had before. "As to the performance, Sir Reginald," Julian went on, his voice dropping, losing none of its carrying quality, "I find myself curious about a performance of my own, namely the one you have given this past year regarding your own finances. I have it on very good authority, from a conversation I was not meant to overhear at my own club some months past, that your interest in a wife without a dowry was rather less generosity than necessity, given the debts you have been quietly renegotiating since your second wife's death left her settlement tangled in chancery. A man who cannot afford a fortune tends to prize, above all things, a woman too grateful to ask questions about his own. 1, 2, 3. He let the silence hang exactly that long before he finished it. I would ask you, Julian said, to reconsider, in future, whose honesty you choose to question in a public room. Coombs' face, in the candlelight, went from red to a mottled white, and he found, evidently, nothing whatever to say to a roomful of witnesses who had just heard his own finances laid bare in exchange for the insult he had offered. He withdrew within the minute, and did not, so far as anyone at Marchwood ever heard again, trouble the Duchess of Stirling with his opinions a second time. Julian turned then to Marianne, and took her hand in front of the whole assembled room. In front of her mother's stricken face, and the dozen lifted eyebrows, and Lady Farrington's own barely disguised delight at having secured, after all, the very best gossip of the season. I did not choose you for a title you did not have, he said, loud enough to carry, or for a fortune you never possessed. I chose you because you told a frightened horse that patience performed is patience wasted. And I have thought of little else since but how rarely, in 31 years, I have met a person who told the truth so plainly and expected nothing for it. I love you, Marianne. I loved you before I ever told you my name, and I will go on loving you long after every rumor in this room has been forgotten. I am only sorry it took a ballroom full of witnesses to say it as plainly as you deserve. She looked at him, and felt the tears come at last, not the hot, hard, suppressed grief of every year before this one, but something entirely different, something that rose easily and fell without asking her permission, because for the first time in her memory the tears were not a danger to be managed, but a joy too large to be contained by silence, and she let them fall. In front of Lady Farrington's chandeliers and her mother's astonishment, and her husband's steady, waiting hands, and found that the world did not end for the weeping, and that nothing at all was lost by it. You saw me, she said, low, only for him, before you ever knew what I was worth on paper. I was only paying attention, he said, and drew her hand to his lips in front of the whole room, and did not release it again for the rest of the night. Georgiana wrote, some months after the ball, a stiff and careful letter asking whether her sister might, after all, receive her, and Marianne, who had spent a great many years learning to forgive slowly and completely, rather than quickly and only in appearance, wrote back that she would be glad of a visit, provided it came without their mother's opinions attached to it. Georgiana came alone, in the end, and stood rather awkwardly in the great hall at Marchwood twisting her gloves, and said with more honesty than Marianne had ever heard from her before, that she had not understood, growing up in the same house, how much had been asked of one daughter, and how little of the other, and that she was sorry for it now in a way she had not thought to be sorry before. It was not everything. It was, Marianne thought, watching her sister's genuine discomfort, rather more than she had expected, and she took it for what it was worth, and did not press for more. Sir Reginald Combe, for his part, sold his remaining property within the year, and removed to Bath, where his debts, no longer disguised by the pretense of an advantageous marriage, caught up with him at last in ways that no drawing-room gossip could soften. No one at Marchwood troubled themselves further with his opinion of anything, and the matter, as far as the ton was concerned, was considered thoroughly and permanently closed. The garden at Marchwood bloomed fully the following June. The roses along the south wall, thick and heavy, headed in a way the old gardener swore he had not seen in 20 years, and it was there, on a warm, sunlit afternoon nearly a year after the ball, that Julian found his wife again on her knees among the beds, though this time with a small, dark-haired boy of some 4 months, propped in a basket at her side, gurgling at the bees working the blooms above him. He will want cutting back again by August, Marianne said, not looking up, working a spent bloom free with the same careful, unhurried hands she had once used on a dead bush in a ruined garden 40 miles distant. This variety never knows when to stop once it has decided to flourish. Rather like his mother, Julian said, lowering himself onto the grass beside the basket, and their son reached one small fist toward him with the same fearless, unthinking trust the grey gelding had learned to give a patient man 2 summers before. "You are not so very different from him," Marion said, glancing at the horse grazing peacefully at the paddock rail beyond the wall, still theirs. Still gentle now with anyone who approached him slowly. "You only wanted someone to stop expecting you to be broken, and to be given time enough to be well instead. It took a great deal of patience, and a great many quiet evenings at a stone wall, before either of you learned to trust it. Then I am glad," Julian said, "that patience was the one thing you never once ran short of, however little of everything else you were given to work with." "I was well," Julian said, watching her face in the gold afternoon light, "the moment a woman at a stone wall told me the truth, without knowing it would cost her a fortune to hear it answered honestly. I have not stopped being grateful for it since." She smiled at him then, unguarded, easy, the smile of a woman who had learned. At last. That being chosen plainly and truly was worth a great deal more than any dowry she had never had to offer, and reached across their sleeping son to take her husband's hand among the roses, in a garden that had needed only patience, and someone willing to stay, to come fully back to life. Above them the bees went on working the roses in the warm June light. Indifferent to dukedoms and dowries, and every ledger that had once tried to price a woman's worth against a fortune she did not have, and the old grey gelding, grazing peacefully beyond the wall, lifted his head once toward the sound of their voices, and then returned, unhurried, unafraid, to the grass, exactly as a thing well loved and well tended is meant to do. Thank you for staying with the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.